I began work on this research project 3 years ago. I was working with Main Street and some conversation came up about historical markers. At the time I hadn't noticed any statuary around the city, nothing that brought to mind the historical aspects of the place or the people who lived here. I learned about Ezra Derby, and during the time, mention was made of his son, Ezra E. Derby. Just briefly, in some pamphlet or booklet, it said he had served in the Civil War. I asked the City of Wayne Historical Museum for any information they had, and Mr. Story kindly looked into it for me. He retrieved a compact set of materials that answered the question I asked, but as soon as I read through it, more questions presented themselves. So here we have a man, and the mystery of his life, associated with the man regarded as the founder of the City of Wayne, Mr. Ezra Derby. In fact, their connection, of course, is that Ezra E. Derby was his son. Most of us know the unfortunate story of Mr. Simmons, who reportedly in a wildly drunken rage killed his wife. For this he was tried, found guilty, and hung by the neck until dead down in the city of Detroit. The drama and real pain attached to that incident lingered until Mr. Derby purchased the land from Mr. Simmons' children and then commenced with intent to work to improve the area. About Mr. Ezra Derby, our esteemed founder, we have some information, and generally it's agreed he came over from Massachusetts to pioneer here in Michigan. His history is very likely interesting, and perhaps someone someday might make a foray to discover more clearly our roots that sprung there from back east, in one of the states that had been one of the original 13 colonies of our nation, the great state of Massachusetts. To begin our story, we will be speaking about this man who was the founder's son. His name, as mentioned, was Ezra E. Derby. As a point of fact, and facts I will give you in abundance, I have to state that I still don't know what Mr. Derby's middle initial stands for. If you know it now, we'll just keep that information until later. I won't guess, and will continue to refer to him throughout this story as Ezra E. Derby, so we can be sure of the person of whom we are talking about. As we progress, you'll find that he was, like yourself, a singular individual and person worthy of respect and honor. We're going to hear the names of people and places who have played a large part in the history of our nation. They are big names. They are taught to us in the schools, and we study their decisions and act upon them till this day. I ask you to consider Ezra E. Derby and the other local personages I will mention to be as your neighbors and possibly your friend. We can certainly look upon the elder Mr. Derby as our benefactor, but there is something else here altogether that his son and our hero, Ezra E. Derby, has given us. Let us first set the international stage in a general way, and the national stage in a particular way. On March 2nd, 1835, the Republic of Texas declared itself independent from the Republic of Mexico. The Mexican government did not appreciate this and promptly invaded the new country of the Republic of Texas in order to reclaim its territory. The new country of Texas likewise took a dim view of this intercession and began to battle with the Mexicans. We are likely familiar with the Battle of the Alamo, which took place between the dates of February 23rd to March 6th, 1836. When 5 years old, the United States that Ezra E. Derby lived in as a little boy was enlarged quite a bit. In 1846, the Oregon boundary dispute was settled with Great Britain. And that was not all. Our extension to the southwestern Pacific coast was completed in 1848, when the Mexican cession took place as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, combined of course with the Louisiana Purchase, which was made decades before. By the time our hero was 8 years old in 1848, the nation had nearly doubled in size, and trouble, as we now know, was on the way. As he grew, games and toys would likely have been important. Here are some common games and toys that were available in the United States in the 1840s. It is possible that because of the industry and expendable income possible in the Derby household, that the children may have enjoyed some of these. We see a doll here, as we will be mentioning Mr. Derby's sister as we continue our journey through this period in our American history and local history here in the city of Wayne. Often during this time, during the 1840s and 1850s, a child's day would begin at first light. They might be sent to the well, put up the fire, boil water, milk the cows, or collect eggs. That's a big difference between what happens today in America, isn't it? They did not have electricity at this time, and running water would likely be secured from a pump if they had one. Just doing the laundry would have been a big deal and taken most of the day for a normal family. Children were taught and expected to learn and master skills that most of us don't need to think about because the products are available for us at the store. Part of what Mr. Derby was doing was to make this a commercial center, so the object of their activities would have been to lay the groundwork for those goods and services. Local children would have learned to cook, bake, make soap for cleaning, and candles for light, unless they used well oil, in which case they would need to learn about those lamps. They would be expected to know how to sew and spin. Eventually, they would go to work in the fields, or in the case here in Wayne, the work may have been around a sawmill, construction, or other preparations like road work. Often girls would work alongside boys. Now, at this time in our story, we have our hero, and he's been born and is active in the world. By the time he had reached the age of 8, his country had changed, and the way Americans were interacting with each other, their environment, and planning their future underwent intense change. During these years, debate raged in Washington concerning expansion. Individuals, companies, and states were involved, and each had a specific idea about what to do. With the expansion, other problems arose. Levels of communications were still rudimentary, though improving. The telegraph had been developed and patented by Samuel Morse in 1837. By the mid-1800s, from 1840 to the 1850s, telegraph lines were being placed across the nation. Our own telegraph road here in Michigan was just that, the telegraph road that ran alongside the telegraph lines. There's even a song about it. It's rather modern. It came out in 1982 and was played by Dire Straits. Lots of things going around here back then, and of course, right up to now. We're going to skip ahead now to the year 1860. At this time, Ezra E. Derby was 20 years old, or about to turn 20. President Lincoln was elected President of the United States on November 6, 1860. We'll take a short break from the heady circumstances about to be related to check in with our hero. He had become married somewhere at this time, or shortly thereafter, to Maria Monroe. Let us say, for their sake, at this time they were happy and planned to have and raise a family in our fair state and in this wonderful place they were building, which has come to be our city of Wayne. Also, to remain constant with the story of our hero, we need to mention that his sister had married Otis C. Southworth, a settler from the state of New York, who is then, of course, in our story and according to our custom, Ezra E. Derby's brother-in-law. To mark this spot in the narrative, we now have the main players of the story and have prepared the scene for the adventure upon which our hero will shortly embark. In the national arena, Abraham Lincoln in Michigan had received 88,450 votes, giving him 57.23% of the electorate in Michigan, over Stephen Douglas, who received 64,889 votes. Also running were John Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat who received 805 votes, and John Bell, a member of the Constitution Union Party, who received 405 votes. The issues dividing the nations had now reached the highest level of the federal government, and the states and all citizens looked on with concern. Slavery, states' rights, trade, war, the Union, so much more. Here in Wayne, the business expansion continued. Settlers continued to arrive from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and the Middle Atlantic states, along with others coming from our neighboring states to take up a position here or near here. The soil was, and still is in many places, some of the most fertile in the world. Business terms were easy and opportunities were plentiful. War and rumors of war were probably spoken and written about, but which would you pay attention to, the good news or the bad? In December of 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Outgoing Michigan Governor Moses Wisner gave a speech to the Michigan legislature in which he said, "This is no time for timid and vacillating councils when the cry of treason and rebellion is ringing in our ears." On January 2nd, 1861, Austin Blair took the office of governor. The state of Virginia sent an invitation to our Michigan state government inviting delegates to attend what was called the Washington Peace Conference. The response from the Michigan legislature included the statement, "Concessions and compromise are not to be entertained or offered to traitors." A very stiff and authoritative statement that the people of Michigan, we shall soon see, were intent on backing up. President Lincoln made a call for troops, and Michigan, as you may know, mustered volunteers into the Army on May 1st, 1861. These volunteers were placed into the 1st Michigan Infantry and dispatched forthwith. They arrived in Washington, D.C. after a journey of nearly 600 miles on May 16th of that same month in 1861. It is said that President Lincoln exclaimed upon their arrival, "Thank God for Michigan." I will state some numbers now to put them in their proper place and mention them. However, numbers will slowly become less and less important in this story as we begin closer attention to our hero. Our state of Michigan during the Civil War sent in the range of 90,000 men, which was approximately 23% of the adult male population of the state at the time. And this includes at least 1,600 black or African American soldiers, so the numbers are expressed as one unit with one intention. Over the course of the conflict, Michigan sent a total of 30 infantry regiments, 11 cavalry regiments, 1 light artillery regiment, 2 light batteries, 2 companies of sharpshooters, and the 1st Michigan Engineers. The Roll of Honor prepared for the Michigan legislature in 1869 contains the names of 14,855 soldiers who were killed in battle. Again, because we're stating the numbers here and now, it should be said that this number includes officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men. But for the purpose of this story, these delineations do not play a role. About 5 months after President Lincoln took office, and a little more than a month since the arrival of troops from Michigan, Fort Sumter in South Carolina was attacked on April 12, 1861, and the Civil War had begun. The idyllic landscape and enterprising atmosphere around here must have been alternatively frozen with shock and burning with intense passions. Both Ezra E. Derby and Otis Southworth joined the Union Army on August 15, 1862. They were mustered into service in Detroit, where they had gone down with, or near the same time with, many other volunteers from this local area and from across the great state of Michigan. There they were inducted into the 24th Michigan Infantry and assigned to the famous Iron Brigade in the Army of the Potomac. The brigade's commander, General John Gibbon, had requested a new regiment be added to his command because its four original regiments, the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana, had become severely depleted by combat action and numbered less than 1,000 men total by October 1862. General Gibbon preferred that it should be a Western regiment since the others were from that part of the country. Gibbon's request was granted, and the 24th Michigan joined the brigade. We are now at that part of the story where the child of a pioneer, of a family with long American experience, had grown strong in the land and formed plans for a future life for himself and his wife. When called, he joined the Army in proud defense of his nation. He put on the uniform and was dispatched to the Southlands to carry out his duty. Training would commence almost immediately and be ongoing. The 24th Michigan Infantry, of which our hero and his brother-in-law were a part, saw their first action, that is, a joint battle for the first time at Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was there, in that fight, that they were recorded as having taken on a nuisance battery of Confederate horse artillery south of the town. I will briefly discourse on this battle to give you an idea of the monumental scope of events our hero, Ezra E. Derby, had become embroiled in. The Battle of Fredericksburg was fought between December 11th to 15th, 1862, and this is about 4 months after our hero joined the Army. It was fought in and around Fredericksburg, Virginia, between General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General Ambrose Burnside. The Union Army's actions resulted in futile frontal attacks on December 13th against entrenched Confederate defenders on the heights and behind the city. It is not a surprise that these entrenchments were formidable because General Lee was the leading authority and engineer in the building of forts. In fact, he had been the designer and architect of most of the forts across the United States, including the newly worked fort in Detroit, Michigan. These repeated and bloody failed attacks and charges are remembered as one of the most one-sided battles of the war. Union casualties were more than 3 times as heavy as those of the Confederates. A visitor to the battlefield described the debacle to President Lincoln as a butchery. John Littlegate, also a soldier in the 24th Michigan Infantry in Company K, who happened to be Henry Ford's uncle, was killed during this battle. So now our hero has been immersed with his brethren in the crucible of war. Back home, his wife with child, his mother and his sister and father and other sibling, whom we know very little other than that he is referred to as the other sibling, were likely living their lives much the same as they had as they waited in intense anticipation for his return. The 24th saw a battle during the Chancellorsville campaign. Again, let me relate the things going on around our hero and his brother-in-law by describing the battle in simple terms. The Battle of Chancellorsville was a major battle. It was part of what is referred to as the Chancellorsville Campaign. It was fought over April 30th to May 6th, 1863 in Spotsylvania County, in Virginia, near the village of Chancellorsville. 2 other battles took place nearby on May 3rd, also in the vicinity of Fredericksburg. This campaign had Union Army Major General Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac against an army less than half its size led by General Robert E. Lee. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia at Chancellorsville and their actions have become to be known as Lee's Perfect Battle. General Lee had divided his army in the presence of a much larger enemy force, and through maneuvers this resulted in a significant Confederate victory. The victory, a product of Lee's audacity and Hooker's timid decision-making, produced heavy casualties. Lieutenant General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson was hit by friendly fire. This required his left arm to be amputated. He died of pneumonia 8 days later. General Lee likened this event to losing his right arm. Our hero now has been swept up not only into the story of the governor of Michigan and the legislature, but the President of the United States. He has traveled across country to Virginia, which was a mighty and prosperous country. He had found there wily and highly trained opponents intent on his demise. Now we're hearing the names of General Lee, Stonewall Jackson, General Hooker, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Reflecting on the actions he's already taken along with his brother-in-law Otis C. Southworth, and those Ezra will take in the immediate future, this is remarkable. Let us pause to reflect on how far these endeavors would have gone if it were not for Ezra, his brother-in-law, and others like them. Not very. Our hero's story, then, has taken on momentous proportions. After Chancellorsville, the 24th Michigan Infantry was entered into battle at Gettysburg. I have to pause here for a moment and point out how important the actions of historians like those here at the City Historical Museum are. We are lucky for a community like this to have a museum director and associate who are both scientists of history and education. I say this because during this research, some of the things I've read about our hero, his father, his brother-in-law, his wife, sister, mother, in some ways I believe they're unattended, but they do not properly convey the story of their history. The remarks are simple and plain, but they mask beneath them the great struggles and lives these people lived. Most importantly, they had nearly severed the connection between them and us, who are their direct benefactors. In any case, thank you to those who have preserved this information for us. Awesome. The Battle of Gettysburg was begun on July 1st and lasted until July 3rd in 1863. It occurred in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This battle, in which Ezra E. Derby and Otis C. Southworth both fought, resulted in the largest number of casualties of any battle during the entire Civil War. It is often referred to as that war's turning point, as up to this time, the Confederate Army was making headway and threatening the capital and the Union itself with invasion and the possibility of defeat. Union Major General Meade's Army of the Potomac worked to defeat attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and finally ended Lee's attempts to invade the North. What is recorded as happening was that after his success at Chancellorsville in Virginia in May 1863, Lee led his army through the Shenandoah Valley to begin his second invasion of the North, which is referred to as the Gettysburg Campaign. Lee intended to shift the focus of the summer campaign from war-ravaged Northern Virginia and hoped to influence Northern politicians to give up their prosecution of the war by penetrating as far as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or even Philadelphia. President Lincoln influenced Major General Joseph Hooker to move his army in pursuit. Hooker was relieved of command 3 days before this battle and was replaced by General Meade. The two armies collided at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. Lee urgently concentrated his forces with the objective of engaging the Union Army and destroying it. Low ridges to the northwest of town were defended initially by a Union cavalry division under Brigadier General John Buford, and soon reinforced with 2 corps of Union infantry. However, 2 large Confederate corps assaulted them from the northwest and north, collapsing the hastily developed Union lines, sending the defenders retreating through the streets of the town to the hills just to the south. The Iron Brigade on July 1st, 1863, engaged with the 26th North Carolina Infantry. The 26th North Carolina Regiment was an infantry regiment of the Confederate State Army. The regiment was composed of 10 companies that came from various counties across North Carolina and Virginia. It's famous for being the regiment with the largest number of casualties on both sides during the war. The 21st Michigan Infantry would suffer the most casualties of any unit at Gettysburg. At this battle, one of the fiercest regiments from the Union met with one of the fiercest regiments of the Confederacy. The 26th North Carolina has its own history. Briefly, it was raised in 1861 from central and western North Carolina with Zebulon B. Vance as its first colonel. Vance was elected governor of North Carolina in 1862, and command of the unit passed to 20-year-old Colonel Henry King Burgoyne, Jr. The 26th spent the year of 1862 defending the North Carolina coast, seeing its first action at New Bern, North Carolina. It went north and fought in the 7 Days Battle before returning to the North Carolina coast. In 1863, it marched northwards and became attached to General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, where they were given the distinction of being not only the largest but the best trained regiment present. General Pettigrew's brigade was attached to the 3rd Corps led by A.P. Hill. From there, the 26th North Carolina marched to Maryland and on into Pennsylvania. On July 1st, 1863, the 26th North Carolina became engaged in the Battle of Gettysburg, with fighting at McPherson's Ridge. The regiment suffered heavy casualties during a fight with the Iron Brigade's 24th Michigan Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The 26th North Carolina lost Lieutenant Colonel Burgoyne and 588 men out of 800. The 24th Michigan was forced to retreat. Overall, the Battle of Gettysburg has been recorded as a Union victory. This is a note about the 24th Michigan Infantry on that day. Went into action with 496 officers and men. Killed and mortally wounded, 89. Otherwise wounded, 218. Captured, 56. Total casualties, 363. 5 color bearers were killed and all the color guard killed or wounded. It was on this day at Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863, that Otis C. Southworth was killed in battle. Here is a note reporting that fact. Killed, Corporal Otis Southworth, Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863. Age, 29. Our hero was now alone. On the 2nd day of the Battle of Gettysburg, most of both armies had reassembled. The Union line was laid out in defensive formation resembling a fishhook, In the late afternoon of July 2nd, Lee launched a heavy assault on the Union left flank, and fierce fighting raged at Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and the Peach Orchard. On the Union right, Confederate demonstrations escalated into full-scale assaults on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. All across the battlefield, despite significant losses, the Union defenders stayed. On the third day, fighting resumed on Culp's Hill, and cavalry battles went on all around, but the main clash was a dramatic infantry assault by 12,500 Confederates against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, known as Pickett's Charge. The charge was repulsed by Union rifle and artillery fire at great loss to the Confederate Army. Lee led his army on a tortuous retreat back to Virginia. Between 46,000 and 51,000 from both armies, soldiers from both armies were casualties in a three-day battle, the most costly in U.S. history. As we continue in this narrative, please realize that Ezra E. Derby is part of the 24th Michigan and has also become, at some part, more or less assigned to a light battery of artillery which stayed close to the 24th Michigan Infantry throughout the following instances. I will touch briefly on this later as this is a point for further research. We shall now review the events involving the 24th Michigan Infantry, of which Ezra E. Derby was a soldier. At this point in our story, please be so kind as to begin to associate Ezra E. Derby, if you will, more closely with the names of those great personages and places we have already heard in school and books and images about this conflict. I repeat again that the resulting circumstances could hardly have been reached without the actions of Ezra E. Derby, Otis C. Southworth, and their families and others like them. From July 5th to July 24th, the 24th Michigan Infantry pursued General Lee and the Confederate Army to Manassas Gap, Virginia. They were assigned shortly thereafter to guard the routes and rails along the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. During this time, they entered into a skirmish at Haymarket, and after Confederate forces had attacked Union cavalry near Buckland Mills. The 24th Michigan Infantry then maintained defenses on the Rappahannock River. On November 19th, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers and redefine the purpose of the war in his historic Gettysburg Address. They entered into battle again at the Battle of Mine Run, where Union General Meade engaged the Confederate General Lee's army. The battles were broken and took place from November 26 to December 2, 1863, and it ended with both sides withdrawing for the rest of the year. It is reported that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote the 1863 poem Christmas Bells, which became the carol I heard, the bells on Christmas Day, after he found out his son Charles Appleton Longfellow had been severely wounded in the Battle of Mine Run. Charles recovered from his wounds, but retired from soldiering. In 1864, over February 6th and 7th of that year, the Michigan 24th Infantry participated in a demonstration on the Rapidan River. In military terminology, a demonstration is an attack or show of force on a front where decision is not sought. It's made with the aim of deceiving the enemy. During March of that same year, the Michigan 24th Infantry became attached to the 1st Brigade, 4th Division, 5th Army Corps. During May 5th through May 7th, they engaged in the Battle of the Wilderness, commanded by Colonel William J. Sewell. This battle took place 50 miles west of Fredericksburg, in an area of dense second-growth forest known locally as the Wilderness. It was the first battle of Grant's overland campaign. The battle resulted in a stalemate with heavy casualties on both sides. It is estimated to be the fourth bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Unlike previous battles where the Army of Potomac pulled back across the river to regroup and try again some other day, this time Grant headed his men around Lee's flank to continue the advance. It would continue like this until, at last, he was at the gates of Richmond, having been carried there by the efforts and trials of men like our hero, Ezra E. Derby. From May 8th to May 1st of 1864, the 24th Michigan Infantry fought at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. On May 8th, the 24th Infantry fought at Laurel Hill. The Battle of Spotsylvania occurred about 50 miles southwest of Fredericksburg, Virginia. Lee raced to try and stay ahead and block Grant's path, and the two forces ran into each other once again north of Spotsylvania Courthouse. For 2 weeks, Grant threw his men against Lee's lines. Most of the attacks were thrown back with heavy losses, but a temporary Union breakthrough on May 10th led to a massive attack on May 12th on the Confederate position known as the Mule Shoe. The Confederate line was broken, and Lee's army was on the edge of disaster. In the end, the Spotsylvania was another stalemate with enormous casualties. It is estimated to be the third bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. In the end, Spotsylvania was another stalemate with enormous casualties. On May 12th, they carried out an assault on a salient. Once again, Grant moved around Lee's flank, continuing on to Richmond. May 23rd and May 26th saw them in a battle at Jericho River Mills on the North Anna River, May 28th to May 31st, they had made contact in battle at Topotomo Creek. On June 1st through June 12th, the Battle of Cold Harbor took place. The Battle of Cold Harbor was fought about 10 miles north of Richmond, Virginia, in what is now the city of Mechanicsville. Cold Harbor was not a port or even on the water. The name comes from the term in use at the time for a tavern or inn where you could sleep, that is, take harbor, but did not serve hot meals. Grant commanded about 108,000 men, and Lee had about 59,000. Meanwhile, the Lee's army was composed almost entirely of experienced veterans. Many Union troops were new conscripts or artillerymen who had spent the war behind the lines in the Washington defenses and who now fought as infantry. This was apparently not the case for Ezra E. Derby, as we shall see later. Even after being transferred or attached to an artillery battle, that unit also was engaged in nearly constant warfare during his service. There are no exact numbers available, and estimates vary for the number of casualties at the Battle of Cold Harbor. Union casualties are estimated between 12,000 and 15,000, with Confederate casualties between 1,500 and 5,000. It was one of the most lopsided casualty rates in the war. The Battle of Cold Harbor was a clear Confederate victory. It was Lee's last great victory of the Civil War. In this, Lee had prevented Grant from breaking through the Confederate lines to capture Richmond, less than 10 miles away. He had caused Grant so many casualties that anti-war sentiment in the North became a serious issue for the Lincoln administration. The battle forced Grant to once more disengage and find another way around Confederate entrenchments, which he did by moving his army to Petersburg. From June 1st to June 3rd, the 24th Michigan Infantry took part in the battle at Bethesda Church. It was on June 16th through 18th that the army arrived before Petersburg and began the siege. Wicked fighting commenced, and the behaviors of the armies changed. On June 17th, close fire and artillery ran into and on the Confederate lines. On the morning of June 18th, it was reported that the Confederates had fallen back. The Michigan 24th Infantry, along with others, was ordered forward over a ridge to support the Pennsylvania infantry, reportedly in peril and jeopardy. After crossing the rise, they discovered that the unit they were supposed to support was not there. Ezra E. Derby was in this force, and they reportedly continued to move forward in an area that now seemed to be free from the enemy. Shortly after their appearance, it became apparent they had entered into a major ambush. Their charge over the ridge had led them very close to the Confederate fortifications around Petersburg. It was not going to be possible for them to pull back until the evening. It was there and at this time that Ezra E. Derby, the hero of the story, was struck in the right chest by a bullet. He fell stricken to earth. Now, during these battles, it was not always possible to remove the wounded right away. Sometimes they had to wait until darkness to be taken off the battlefield, and even then were still exposed to sniper fire and direct attack. As it was, later that day or in the evening of that day, Ezra E. Derby was transported to the hospital at City Point, Virginia. He lay, and we don't know in what condition, except that it was serious, until he passed away and died 5 days later on June 23, 1864. The Civil War continued after Ezra E. Derby died, and finally Petersburg fell and Richmond following. The Civil War ended on May 9, 1865, after nearly 4 years of strife. The Union had won the war with the aid and assistance and courage and sacrifice of the lives of Ezra E. Derby, his brother Otis C. Southworth, and thousands upon thousands of others like them. President Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, so this ends the portion of this narrative concerning our hero Ezra E. Derby. During the course of gathering this information on this work, I came across a note in the book published about the history of Westland that had Mr. Derby transferred into a light artillery battle. The note mentioned that he was an extra caisson driver. The note was written rather like an offhand remark. The power of words, as you know, is considerable, and with the knowledge that I had about these events, I wondered exactly what had been the duties if he was doing this thing. I found that even if we consider this alternative path for Ezra E. Derby during all these engagements, the work would still have been hard and dangerous. I've been given a listing of some of the battles now, locations and dates, and a few of the main personages that Mr. Southworth and Mr. Derby were engaged with in these battles as infantrymen, and so because further research on this matter is also called for, I will be brief with addressing the reference to the Life Battery, and allow that further research to answer the questions of the meritorious service of our young hero. Please keep in mind that either way this story is viewed, and I think he's got two paths here, he still moved through the same locations and harrowing experience that will be forever associated with the conflict. Respect and honor is due him as we recall his lost life in the assault on Petersburg for our nation and our future. Now here is a written report concerning the activities of the Light Battery referenced with Ezra E. Derby's service and its actions in just one battle. Keep in mind they are moving large cannons in concert, handling high explosives, and being shot at with rifle, pistol, cannon, and sometimes engaged in hand-to-hand combat depending on the issue. Because of his experience with horses and wagons here in Wayne and on his farm, Mr. Derby's services would have been needed by a unit like this. I don't have to defend our hero, Ezra E. Derby, as he has already defended me. This unit I mentioned was closely associated with the 24th Michigan Infantry. That is, they fought together throughout the war. And the action that I will now relate took place at Fredericksburg. This is from pages 468 to 469 of Operations in Northern Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Number 213, report of 2nd Lieutenant James Stewart, Battery B, 4th U.S. Artillery. Sir, I have the honor to submit the following report on the operations of Light Battery B, 4th U.S. Artillery during the engagement of the 13th. On the morning of the 13th, I was ordered by General Doubleday to shell the wood directly in my front, in distance about 800 yards. After shelling some time and driving out the enemy's cavalry picket, I ceased firing. After a short time, I received another order from General Doubleday to commence again, as he was going to move the division forward. After throwing several spherical case, the division moved forward and took position. I was then ordered by the general to go to the assistance of Captain Garish's battery. Colonel Wainwright directed me to go on the right of that battery, which at the time was under fire from 2 batteries on our extreme left. I immediately came in battery, and after firing several rounds from each gun, succeeded in silencing the enemy's fire, blowing up one of their caissons and driving them off. During this time, another battery of the enemy on our left opened an enfilade fire. I immediately changed positions and engaged it, and after firing some 20 minutes, drove him off, disabling one of his guns and blowing it up a caisson, and preventing him from carrying his disabled gun off 3 successive attempts. Although well supported by his sharpshooters, who were very destructive to my men and horses, in this position I had 2 men killed, besides the loss of 8 horses killed, 4 wounded so severely as to be abandoned, 1 slightly wounded, and 2 sets of wheel and 4 sets of lead harness being so cut up by the fragments of shell as to be utterly unserviceable. During the latter part of the engagement, my battery was supported by the 14th Brooklyn. From that time until about 9 p.m., I was under the fire of the enemy's mass batteries from different points, one of them firing canister, but evidently at high elevation. The battery remained in this position, occasionally firing until 9 p.m. of the 15th instant. During time, the battery was ably supported by the 14th Brooklyn, 22nd, 24th, and 35th New York State Volunteers. The battery, on recrossing the Rappahannock, took position to cover the pontoon bridges below Fredericksburg, remaining in battery until about 12 midnight on the 16th instant. The behavior of Lieutenant James Davison, 3rd U.S. Artillery, temporarily attached to the battery, is deserving of a special commendation. Of the non-commissioned officers and privates, I cannot speak too highly. When all have done well, it would appear invidious to make distinctions, but at the same time, I beg leave to call your special attention to the following as being deserving of commendation. That is, 1st Sergeant John Mitchell, Sergeant Andrew McBridge, Lance Corporals Alonzo Priest, Henry G. McDougal, Jeremiah Murphy, Edward B. Armstrong, and Edgar A. Thorpe, and Privates John B. Leckie and John Sanborn. The following is recapitulation of the losses sustained by my battery: killed 2 men and 8 horses, wounded 6 men and 5 horses. The battery, on being supplied with harness for 6 horses, will be ready for immediate service. James Stewart, 2nd Lieutenant, 4th. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant. James Stewart, 2nd Lieutenant, 4th Artillery, Commanding Light Battery B, Captain J. Reynolds, Acting Chief of Artillery, 1st Division. When seeking information on the life of our hero, I found written that there was a headstone in Farmington that was likely a cenotaph. The cenotaph is a tomb-like monument to someone buried elsewhere, especially one commemorating people who died in the war. It could just be a short flat stone like you might see at some of the cemeteries. I had thought perhaps that I might learn more about him, or at least be able to visit his grave to pay my respects if I knew for sure where he was buried. I contacted the caretaker at a City Point Cemetery in Virginia, but it turned out there is no regular caretaker there anymore. I was directed in a letter to contact a park ranger who handled the City Point grounds and hospital. All this was done by mail at this point because there were no email addresses available to me. This time, however, the ranger did contact me via email and asked me what I was seeking. I told him, and he said he would get back to me. I waited a week and then received a communication from him asking me to forgive him for the amount of time it took, but my inquiry was unique. He told me that Ezra E. Derby had not been buried at City Point, Virginia, and it appeared that his family had sent for his body to be returned home. He said this was not a common practice at the time and indicated something special, but he could not phrase what it was. He also told me that during his investigation he took a look at pension records to see if there was any notice there that might give a clue to what had happened, right? He told me that normally these records are 20 or 30 pages long. He had seen one that was 70 pages long one time and another one that was 90 pages long. He was quite impressed by this. But the records associated with Mr. Ezra E. Derby comprise a record of more than 300 pages. So there's some information there. He also told me that it was odd that Mr. Derby had been sent into the 24th because it had been depleted. So there's some obvious evidence of his movement there. I thanked him now and went on to find where Mr. Derby's grave was exactly. I ended up contacting the Charter Township of Farmington Hills that handles the burial site, and they searched and searched and finally turned me over to a very nice lady clerk who said she would help me. She searched and searched and searched, and 2 weeks later sent me the location of a grave that might be one of my ancestors. So I was establishing a relationship with her. Well, I spoke with her again, and she told me that she sent the wrong page, and she apologized and would send the right one right away. In a few minutes, I did have the location, and I traveled to the graveyard a week later. I cleared off his grave and said kind words and decided to write this presentation so he could know all about our hero, Ezra E. Derby, and what he had done to protect us all and preserve our liberty, freedom, and dignity. Okay, that's it. Ezra E. Derby, our hero, returns home. Ezra E. Derby, born 1840, died June 23, 1864, age 24. Otis Southworth died July 1st, 1863, age 29.